Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, here on a beautiful late spring afternoon in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., with the pleasure of talking to an expert on the topic we're about to address, David Bahnsen, who is founder and president of the Bahnsen Group in New York City. He is also an active Christian layman and is expert at addressing issues, public issues and economic issues from a faith perspective. I'm going to ask him about tariffs and to share his knowledge and expertise on that topic and on wider economic implications and why we as Christians and as Americans should be attentive to this issue. So, David, thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mark. Pleasure to be with you.
So, the last several months, obviously, tariffs have been a major topic of conversation. It's a safe guess that most American Christians don't have expertise on this topic and aren't quite sure what to think. So if you're starting out fresh, what is your perspective on tariffs and how should we understand them?
Well, it's important to kind of start with the context of what brought tariffs up. And it really isn't just the last couple of months. This issue of some form of protectionism and industrial policy and the idea of using tariffs to have some positive impact on domestic economic needs, American workers, really was a part of the Trump 1.0 campaign platform. So now we're going back to summer of 2015. So it's a sort of 10-year story that has definitely intensified in its relevance in the last couple months because of the implementation. Before I go into my high-level case that is highly skeptical and negative on tariffs, I would point out that even those that are wanting to come to this subject with some sympathy for the administration's agenda, for the administration's policy inclinations, and for a number of the things that have been thrown out that they're trying to address with tariffs, it is helpful to realize how non-cohesive the message is, the rationale is. We don't have the luxury of being able to say, they've made a case for ABC and here's a case against it. Because we're being told 4 or 5 or 6 different things, often very contradictory to one another, all at once. One is that tariffs are wonderful and they're going to make us rich. The other is, don't worry, we're not going to do tariffs. They're just a negotiating tactic. One is, we need tariffs to bring back jobs to the United States. But the other is, they're going to reduce the deficit. Well, how do you get revenue from tariffs if they bring jobs back to the United States? And so they're not generating revenue because we're not importing the products because now it's moved into domestic manufacturing. You could get one or the other, but you obviously couldn't get both. We're sometimes told it's a matter of national security and critical infrastructure, but then are we looking to stop dependency on adversarial actors, or are we just looking to get paid from adversarial actors while we sell away national security? So there's a lot of different factors out there. And for a guy who is so boring and non-fun as I am, I really prefer more logical conversations that allow us to go through structured one by one and deal with the argument, but this jumps all over the map and it makes it very difficult. So I am essentially in the school of thought that tariffs are a byproduct of a central planning view of the economy, that the role of government to try to pick winners and losers and protect one American economic actor while hurting another American economic actor is very bad policy. I simultaneously fully support us having no fears in national security as it pertains to products that we need. And therefore, if any element of our critical infrastructure and military security required imports from adversarial actors, I would not want a tariff on it. I'd want to eliminate it immediately. So I have a very hard view to protect national security, but a very opposed view of using tariffs as a matter of economic protectionism.
Now, throughout the spring, the market experienced wide, dramatic swings, negative against tariffs, exultant when tariffs seem to be receding. Why do the markets despise tariffs so much?
Well, I think that they do despise tariffs for the obvious reason of them being an input cost. They essentially represent a cost that diminishes profits, and markets are in the business of profits. But I actually think that's the second biggest factor, Mark, in terms of what's happened here this spring that has hurt markets around the tariff conversation. Even more than the actual input cost of tariffs is the uncertainty that the tariff development introduced an uncertainty that froze a lot of economic activity, delayed a lot, that made it difficult to do economic calculation. So much of our imports are actually American manufacturers that import some of the unfinished goods into their process. So it's made it very difficult for American domestic manufacturers to do business. It's certainly changed the scenario for consumers that are waiting on various products. It's created a lot of uncertainty at ports and with freight, shipping, cargo. And then it's made it extremely difficult for American exporters because there's then been retaliatory tariffs. There's been a breakdown in total trade, regardless of the ratio between imports and exports. Total trade comes down. And so all of this leads to a total freeze of capital goods investment. And when from those of us who believe that economic growth comes from the supply side of the economy, anything that puts downward pressure on production, even if it's a delay while markets wait to get some indication of what's going to happen, that means diminished economic growth. Now, the president, to his credit, saw the way markets were responding and 4 days later peeled back on what was the worst part, in my mind, of the tariff announcements, which were somewhat incoherent tariffs announced oftentimes against allies, oftentimes against countries that have no tariffs on us at all. But nevertheless, there's still uncertainty with auto sector, with steel and aluminum, and of course the broad deal with China, who is a major trading partner. So all of those uncertainties still linger.
And obviously, there's the issue that the high tariffs effectively empower the executive to strike special exception deals with favored industries in exchange possibly for favors in the future.
Well, and they not only set the table for it, they literally facilitated just that in this case. In the case of semiconductors, electronics, and component parts, essentially the stuff that companies like Apple and Nvidia and Google and Amazon swim in, it took about 2 days for them to get just that carve out. So while various American manufacturers of widgets and textiles and agriculture and small businesses did not receive such carve outs, multi-trillion-dollar companies were getting those. And it is, I believe, a downside to tariffs, particularly administered this way, where it's all coming out of the executive branch with no congressional authority, is it essentially puts 100% discretion in the ability of one person. And whether that person was Republican or Democrat, conservative, liberal, is somewhat immaterial. It becomes a very imperialistic view of economic administration.
Are high tariffs intrinsically at odds with any constructive notion of a free economy or of capitalism itself?
Well, that's a tricky question because many will want to throw back that we actually used tariffs in the late 18th century and early 19th century, and that some of the folks that were supportive of such were no less than Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. And so I think that they would be considered pretty market capitalist friendly founding fathers. The difference here is so important to avoid a almost silly historical revisionism. Government spending as a percentage of GDP was soaking wet 1 or 2%. It's now well over 20%. Post-COVID got up to an astonishing 27%. There is no world in which tariffs can fund government now. We did not have an income tax when tariffs were a form of taxation used to legitimately fund revenue. The administration is not using tariffs where if every single thing they've threatened were done, it brings in $250 billion. We spend $6 trillion a year. And the actuality of tariffs really imposed in all of 2018 and 19, I think, was $40 billion. And right now is somewhere in the same range because of all these exceptions and uncertainties in the court and whatnot. So we're basically talking about 1% of the size of government. So when Calvin Coolidge had a certain degree of tariffs in the 1920s, he lowered the capital gain tax to 7.5%. He substantially lowered the corporate income tax rate. If we were talking about lowering marginal rates and using tariffs as a broad-based means of additional revenue to government, I think it's worth the conversation. We would have to remember the trade-off reality that we may be facing a both and, not an either or. But also, we have to just be intellectually honest that that's not what we're talking about right now. We're not talking about tariffs as a superior funding of government mechanism to the income tax. We're talking about using it to control and obtain a certain outcome, trying to change the weighting of foreign versus domestic consumption, foreign versus domestic production, services versus goods, role in the economy. So we're talking about tariffs not as a means of government funding, but as some sort of central planning mechanism.
And as some supporters of tariffs claim, do they support and protect domestic industries and create American jobs?
Well, they do not. And if they did, they only could do it by hurting other jobs. But the reality, because we are the largest by far exporter to the world of services. So anything we do to try to beef up greater domestic manufacturing of goods that then is hurting our ability to export services, countries are obviously not going to just take it lying down. There's going to end up being retaliatory measures. We basically fill up one side of the pool and empty it on the other. Only in this case, we are talking about trying to benefit a lower paying segment of the economy and hurting a higher paying segment of the economy. Let's use the steel and aluminum example. There are 80 jobs in America dealing with steel as an input for every one job that is behind steel production. 177 jobs using aluminum as an input for every one job that is trying to produce aluminum. So any effort to help the one job of aluminum producer or steel producer comes at a cost of, to some degree, of where there are exponentially more jobs in a different part of the economy that hurts more than the element is being helped. So I don't believe on a net basis anyone can credibly claim it is useful for jobs. It most certainly was not out of 2018. In fact, the minimal impact we saw out of China resulted in more than 100% of what we took away from China. More than 100% of that moved not to Ohio and Arizona, but to South Korea, India, Vietnam, and Mexico. Here's the final thing I will say. I believe we have to be realistic and honest about the fact that if it were effective and successful, which I do not believe it would be, in incentivizing more factory construction and American production, I would not support it by basis of the government picking winners and losers and the net cost to other elements of the economy, exporters, etc., that I just talked about. But even if I accepted the premise, those jobs would be filled by robots. we're talking about ability to do that manufacturing with so much more technology and automation that it's still not a boon to workers. And there's just not been a sober honesty about that.
Is there a Christian perspective on tariffs, or is it just a matter of economic science?
Well, it's certainly not just a matter of economic science, because I don't believe that there is a central planning science behind this, but there is an economic principle that I think should be rooted to first things. And it does speak, first of all, to some of the basic incentives and economic laws at play that deal with trade-offs. I think it's worthwhile to consider, are we helping American worker, or are we giving cosmetic help to the worker, but actually doing a greater amount of damage? These sort of unintended consequences that I think do have moral implications in the way we think about them. If a policy sounds good morally, the basic principle that I think is very much rooted in Christian theology of wanting good working conditions and good outcomes for the American worker, I'd be supportive of that theologically. But if the economics of the matter actually harm them, then I don't think we could say, well, it looked good or it sounded good. The intentions of the policy are not good enough for a Christian. And that's what I think you're dealing with here, is at best case, there's good intentions. But the fact of the matter is, when we dig deeper, the negative impact outweighs the positive in a way that I think has theological implication. There's also a respecter of persons, a partiality consideration at play, where the notion that one sector exports a lot, is an American industry, American company, and another imports, and we want to help one and hurt the other. I think that there's a moral unfairness to that, the government putting their hand on the scale to benefit one voting bloc and hurting a different economic bloc. This is why I do believe that a laissez-faire bias, especially in this particular issue that is so susceptible to cronyism, is the more theologically appropriate solution when we adjudicate this matter of public policy.
There has been this trend in very recent years of conservative Christians who over the previous decades had been reflexively more pro-free market, moving in a more statist direction. How do you explain that?
How do I explain it? Or how do I, it's so interesting because I can't explain it, but I certainly want to be occupied with it. I want to engage it, resist it, where there are people of good faith wrestling with things, make an argument. I think that, as I have pointed out in many speeches and writings since the financial crisis, I do believe a lot of this came from a slow evolving conclusion that the presupposed moral argument for markets failed in 2008. And in a post-crisis world, we had sort of given away the moral superiority to the moral authority to the Bernie Sanders progressive AOC wing that would argue for certain matters of economic justice and certainly, as you say, more of a statist intervention. And that thinking was able to be wed to a right-wing populism, has caught many people off guard, but I think it largely was just a byproduct of this post-crisis wrestling. And all of that, to me, has its roots in an inadequate foundation to our defensive markets to begin with. Put short, it was excessively utilitarian and insufficiently moral. The grounding of the argument was inadequately rooted to proper moral philosophy.
David Bahnsen, I could pelt you with many, many more questions, but what you've said already is wonderful and helpful. Thanks so much for a very enlightening interview, and we'll continue to look to your articles in National Review and elsewhere articulating this perspective.
Well, thank you so much. Enjoyed being with you, Mark.